Hello, I'm Dr. Steven Hassan, and I'm so excited about this edition of the Influence Continuum. I have two guests today. Usually I have one, but there's two individuals that each bring some really important perspectives, experience, and will help illuminate so much. First, I want to introduce an old friend and colleague, Frederick Clarkson, who is a senior research analyst at the Political Research Associates, which is a progressive think tank in Somerville, Massachusetts. Fred interviewed me after I got out of the Moonies way back in the 80s, so we go way back. He's also the author of a very important book that I recommend everyone read called Eternal Hostility, The Struggle Between Theocracy and Democracy, which is what everyone's talking about in the media these days. And Fred, and then I want to introduce André Gagné, who I was grateful to interview when I was doing the Cult of Trump. Oh, and I have to say, Fred really was amazingly helpful in the writing, research and writing of the Cult of Trump, editing, and just educating me a lot. So thank you, Fred, for that. Back to you, Andre. I interviewed you, and we have a blog with that interview. I think it was 2018 or 19. You are a full professor in the Department of Theological Studies at the University Concordia in was it Montreal? And you've written a book in French all about Trump, and now you tell me that it's going to be published in English. I'm so excited. I'm going to ask you to explain that. You are an experienced person in terms of researching and understanding New Apostolic Reformation. And this article that came out in Religion Dispatches is exactly about that, and a schism that's appearing between those who still think God wants Trump to be president, and others that are realizing there's no future in that one. And Andre, you've been interviewed by a billion places, the New York Times, Washington Post, etc. But I want to use our time to dive in, please. Um, Tell us what's happening and what the public needs to know. And I'm gonna ask Fred to just set the table for us, Fred, because you've been warning people about the rise of the religious right and how they've been doing politics even though they weren't supposed to be doing politics. And then Trump came into power and said, "Oh yeah, you can do politics in churches." And all of these, the media keeps saying, white Christian evangelicals are his base. And for everybody that I know who is a Christian, they say the NAR is not traditional Christianity in any. It's a new invention. Anyway, that's my platter. Take it on, Fred, please.
Well, yeah, there is this large Pentecostal and charismatic movement that's kind of been reorganized and reframed into what we're calling the New Apostolic Reformation. I'll leave it to Andre to tell us more about exactly what that is.
Yeah,
He's a better
it's
story than I am.
yeah, it's
But
by the way, I just want to just before Fred continues, I really want to say that this was an opportunity, a great opportunity for me to write with this veteran journalist who's been around forever. So I was extremely honored to be to be part of this.
Immortal now.
So wait a minute, just for our listeners, you're complimenting Fred on
Yeah,
this piece. Thank
yeah,
you. Just wanted to be clear that
yeah,
people aren't confusing it with
yeah.
whoever is doing your new book, the English. Okay, back
No, no,
back
no.
to you, Fred.
It was a great opportunity to collaborate with Andre, and we've intended to do it for a long time. We finally got to it because this amazing thing happened. The evangelicalism and the Christian right more broadly has evolved. A lot of us operate with little snapshots in time. Some of us haven't gotten past the Falwell era or the Robertson era, or even the George Bush era when somebody said that he was the leader of the Christian right. Wasn't true, but but we arrive at these understandings to try to help us to filters to help us to see what's going on. But we're talking about a very dynamic movement, and and what it has become is the key part of the Christian right, what many people now call Christian nationalism, that brought Trump to power. And Trump surrounded himself in his administration with NAR, New Apostolic Reformation, related people. His spiritual advisor, Paula White, was an NAR apostle, right?
And Paula spoke for the Moonies this last weekend, by the way, in
That's right. She
Korea.
spoke at a conference along with
Just
Mike Pompeo and
yes, and Esper and Gingrich and a few other folks. Sorry for interrupting you, Fred.
no, that's okay, because that's been a part of the long-term pattern of Moon involvement with the Christian right and with American political leaders.
Exactly.
So that NAR figures are present at a Moon event on an international stage like that. It demonstrates the significance of the movement itself.
Yes.
Even in the post-Trump era. So they are very politically engaged, and what makes them different, perhaps, than other conservative Christians that we could talk about is that they believe that they're living in an end times scenario. That's not entirely unusual, but their apostles and the prophets believe that God can speak to them and through them. And whatever one may think about the validity of that, there's a lot of political and personal opportunism that exists when you become the voice of God. And that's what a number of some NAR leaders took exception to what we saw around leaders of the Trump supporting apostles who were spreading the lie that the election, that God supported Trump, was stolen, and that God is going to restore Trump to power. Those are the three big lies.
Yep.
And some apostles and prophets took exception to that. They said, no, this is just political opportunism and doesn't represent any kind of authentic form of the kind of Christianity that they represent. And so they established a set of standards for prophets that they published and named, well, indirectly named, many of the leaders of their own movement who were among the worst offenders. It's a remarkable and historic thing, I think, that we're seeing happen.
If I can just state for our listeners, in my world of helping people out of cults, I deal with cult leaders all the time, and they claim to speak directly to God, or they claim to be God, or they claim to be Jesus. And they build up this behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotional control hold on their followers and scare them that Satan is going to possess them and they have to be covered and protected by the prophet or the apostle. And these people are being programmed to be spiritual warriors, which means they should spend all their time online and in doing politicking, right? And give all their money over, because this is monumentally important. But it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck and has feathers like a duck. So when I was writing The Cult of Trump, and Fred, I thank you for calling my attention to NAR, I was nervous to say, oh yeah, 30 to 40 million Americans are in mind control cults, but it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck. So can I go to you, André?
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, and I exactly what Fred said really summarizes the issues that we tried to discuss in our piece. One of the things we need to mention, and Fred said this, and this is something that we constantly need to reemphasize, is that the NAR is not a denomination per se. It's really a movement. And even C. Peter Wagner, who is responsible in a sense for the constitution of what became or is now called the New Apostolic Reformation, understood this as a movement. Okay. And the core elements are what we can call the core element of the NAR is this issue of apostolic governance. And what we have seen in this unfolding with the prophetic standards, and both of you have talked about the issue of speaking in the name of God. It's all about competing revelatory authority and discourse. It boils down to that. Who is authorized who is recognized to speak on behalf of God? And are there mechanisms in place to determine what is true from what is deviance? And when we look at the standards, this is not new. We've talked about it in our piece. There's a situation in the 90s with the Kansas City Prophets, where we had an issue of trying to rein in certain prophetic abuses at the time. It partially worked for a very short period of time, but then it disintegrated. And when we think in terms of C. Peter Wagner, he had in mind making sure that there was a framework
Hmm.
for apostles and how apostles related to prophets and how prophets had to be accountable to apostolic authority. And
Hmm.
this was not necessarily something that Wagner himself had invented. We have people in the days of Wagner. We have this individual that labels himself as an apostle prophet by the name of Bill Hammond, who
Hmm.
was around during the rise of the prophetic movement. And he was already writing books on the prophetic ministry, on how you should conduct, what are the guidelines to recognize a prophet, how a prophet functions, what is the role of the prophet, what are the limits and standards of prophecy.
Hmm.
So what happened essentially is that Wagner, influenced by people like Bill Hammond, who, by the way, and we couldn't put this in the piece, but something that came up and that Fred was thinking about is that they go about by different names. They don't always wear the label of apostle or prophet. Some of them call themselves pastors or bishops. Bill Hammond is a bishop, for example.
Hmm.
He calls himself a bishop. So Wagner just inherits from that. So the NAR, in a nutshell, what we can say about the NAR is it's the project of C. Peter Wagner, and
Hmm.
it is the reflection of Wagner's own journey in ministry when he
Hmm.
was interested by church growth and then into prophetic ministry and spiritual warfare and so on. And everything culminated in what we call today the New Apostolic Reformation.
Great. I need to ask you a question, Fred, if I may, after listening to Andre, because in understanding what's called fourth generation warfare, which is psychological warfare to delegitimize science and truth and leaderships and experts and institutions, my understanding is Lind paired up with Paul Weyrich of the Christian right. And so there was this unholy connection of military psyops with the Christian right. And I'm wondering how that fits into potentially the NAR movement.
Well, I'm not sure if there's a direct connection, although there might very well be.
Mm-hmm.
That it's right that there's similar kinds of things going on, because what the NAR is all about is not all about, but one of the things that they do is they're about delegitimizing the institutions of democracy, which they don't believe, and the institutions of Christianity,
Mm.
which see doctrines of other denominations, Catholics, mainline Protestants, other evangelicals, you name it, and particularly their institutions as barriers,
Mm-hmm.
understandably so. People who have different institutions and believe differently are getting in the way. They want everybody to believe like them. So yes, the idea of delegitimizing their opposition, if you will, in terms of how society should be governed and how Christianity should be governed, is the absolute core of the threat to civilized society all over the world that they actually represent.
Yeah. And my understanding, and I've got a professor of theology here, being Jewish, the notion of prophets came from my tribe, Torah, Old Testament. And my understanding is that if somebody made a prophecy that didn't come true, scripture says you should stone them to death.
Yeah.
Am I right, Doc?
Yeah, for sure. That's in the Bible. That's in
Right.
the
So
Old
when you're telling me they came
Yeah.
up with criteria for prophets, and if they're saying, they got a revelation, Trump was elected in 2020,
Yeah.
then they either have to be stoned to death or they have to blame Biden and the Democrats and the satanic Illuminati for stealing it.
There's always a backdoor answer to their,
Uh-huh.
there's always a way to kind of circumvent these types of problems. First of all, what they will say, and especially you'll see it in the prophetic standards, but you'll see it also in responses, in various types of responses that came out, for example, in Christianity Today, where people will say that prophecy, if they do believe in prophets today, they are not equivalent prophets as those of the Old Testament prophets. They function more in terms of how prophetic the prophetic or prophecy functioned in the context of the New Testament. And it's not infallible
Mm-hmm.
because the Bible says that we understand and we know things in part or partially. But
Mm-hmm.
when Christ returns, we will know all things fully. So
Mm-hmm.
it is possible to prophesy partially, but not with exact precision. So they
Yeah.
will it's a kind of a cop out. You
Yes, I'd
understand?
say it's a
Yeah,
big cop out
it
from
is a
my
big
perspective.
absolutely. But they will look at this more from a New Testament perspective to kind of keep in motion the legitimacy of prophecy and prophets. Because for
Mm-hmm.
them, it boils down again to the validity of what they understand to be the fivefold ministry. Sometimes this goes by the name of the ascension gifts
Mm-hmm.
of apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. And that's
Mm-hmm.
in the letter to the Ephesians.
Mm-hmm.
So they say this is still valuable for today. But again, you'll have all sorts of people that will understand this very differently, that will not see, for example, apostles and prophets as an office, but more as a function, as
Mm-hmm.
a kind of an anointing, a
Mm-hmm.
role that someone would have, but not an office. And they would not equate, for example, modern day apostles to the 12 apostles of Jesus. You see?
Right.
So there's all sorts of ways to kind of try to navigate this to make
Yeah.
sense for them
All I
of
can
this
say
perspective.
is watching handkerchiefs get rid of COVID or the chanting with Supreme Court justices, this is not like healthy. I mean, I can't help myself. I'm a student of social psychology as well as a clinically trained mental health professional, and it seems to me like this is programming. This is hypnotic programming, repetition, and fear. And I might add, I've had many clients who were exercised, these are air quotes that I'm doing in the video, and had nervous breakdowns because they were convinced they were filled with demons and they couldn't get rid of the demons. And it turned out they were doubting the prophet. Like that was the problem. They needed to get out of the cult.
Where part of the rift and the schism is what Andre was talking about, because the prophetic standards people see the rogue prophets as going in the direction of individualist Old Testament prophets, right?
Mm-hmm.
What the prophetic standards people want to do is say, well, look, you might hear something pretty wild, but before you go public with it, you really should, consult with some group of elders, right? Some apostles to confirm whether it's something that's of God or just something that a frail human being cooked up.
Mm-hmm.
That's where they want to go. And what I think is so interesting is that for a movement that considers itself to be non-denominational,
Mm-hmm.
starting to behave like a denomination, right? You can't
Good point.
have a bunch of people going off in all directions, saying all kinds of stuff, and claim to represent the same thing.
Mm.
It's a herding cats kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Do it, and they won't admit it. They keep putting out standards, and everybody keeps violating, including their own leaders. They have no mechanisms of accountability, and it's never going to work. Therefore, one of the things that the rest of us are confronted with is a movement that is going in the direction of making wild prophecies, making wild accusations, being socially disruptive, even against their own people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, for sure. And if I can add to what
Please.
Fred was saying, it's exactly that. In terms of uh, when you look, for example, at the question of authority, it's who's going to, in the end, make the standard. Now, when we look at the prophetic standards, for example, and you
Mm-hmm.
have a link through in the article to the prophetic standards, a lot of what they say is supported by scripture. The
Mm-hmm.
idea that prophecies are to be evaluated or weighed, what Fred was saying in terms of, hey, you need to make sure, you need to check out, if your prophecy makes sense or not. This is biblical.
Right.
So they're trying to go back to some form of, it's a prophetic standard, but some form of biblical anchorage to say, listen, whoa, you have to weigh prophets. You have to weigh prophecy, and the spirit of prophets is submitted to prophets. That means that
Mm-hmm.
people can't just go on wild goose and lose control over what they're saying.
Right.
They can prophesy and actually engage in intelligent forms of speaking out or speaking the word of God, if someone can understand prophecy in those terms.
But Professor, I need to ask you directly, because maybe I don't understand the New Testament, even though I've read it several times and I've been learning from very learned theologians. My understanding is Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world," or "Render unto Caesar
Yep.
what Caesar's," or "It's harder for a camel to go through the eye of a
Yes.
needle than a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven." And what I'm seeing with these groups is money and power and power and money and
And
sex
politics.
abuse and
Yeah.
money and power, and the opposite. And Fred, I have to ask you to talk about your book and the quote, of eternal hostility, given the time that we're living in right now in the United States.
Well, sure, happy to do that. But I want to call people's attention to your Twitter feed, where there's a prophet named Julie Green, right? And the picture from her own Twitter stream that you posted shows her saying something about how a leader is going to die, right? And then there's a picture in the background of the White House burning. This is the kind of excess that the prophetic standards people are concerned about. But this isn't just a micro theological issue. This is disruptive of society, right? This is delegitimization of democratic institutions and using the force of the voice of God to say the White House might burn and the president might die. She doesn't say it, but she implies it. And part of the disingenuousness of the whole thing, too.
Yeah, I want to plug a book called Lone Actor Terrorism. It's Oxford University Press. And I did a chapter in it that basically says, you guys got it all wrong. These people are being radicalized online and they're going out to commit these acts of violence. This is not just people coming up with, I think I'm going to ram the White House today and shoot myself in the head.
Yeah, they're being revved up at the very least. And Julie Green is a perfect example of it, and why, even the leaders of the NAR are concerned.
Mm-hmm.
But to back to your question about the title of the book, now, this was back in the day. The title comes from Thomas Jefferson.
Mm-hmm.
And inside the rotunda of the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, you can look and see, I've sworn on the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man.
Hmm.
And that was, the quote comes from a letter he wrote to his friend, Dr. Benjamin Rush, over the issues, as I recall, of the personal attacks made against Jefferson and his religious character. Because political opponents in one of his elections were running around, particularly the clergy in New England, were saying that, agents of Jefferson are going to come and seize your family Bibles if he's elected. And so that's when Jefferson said what he said.
You mean there was disinformation back then?
Yeah, it took a little different form,
Yeah.
but indeed, making up prophetic lies, to discredit a political opponent and alarm people with something not just politically bad but ungodly is going on.
Hmm.
That's why that's why it's inside the rotunda of the Jefferson Memorial, because it's an eternal issue, right? We're always going to have these kinds of problems, and the part of the task of the American experiment, the experiment of any democratic society, is to understand how are we going to contend with these kinds of elements that are authoritarian and totalitarian, anti-democratic, and will resort to absolutely anything, including telling lies about what God is telling them in order to accomplish ends. What do we do?
Yeah, so I have to ask you, what do we do, Fred and Andre? Please guide us. There's so many activists who are concerned. Now they're waking up to the state, Project Blitz playbook, which you outed years ago, and you did Blitz Watch, and you've been trying to warn, but now people are like, "Oh, we've got to do something." What do we do?
Well, not a panacea here, but one basic piece of the puzzle is that if we're going to preserve democracy, we have to act like it's a democracy. A long time ago, back in the 80s, the strategists of this movement figured out that they could use the tools of electoral democracy to erode and to end it, because they realized that a relatively small fraction of the eligible voters, right,
Hmm.
are even registered, and a smaller fraction of those turn out in, I think it's something like 60 to 70% good presidential election year. And the farther down the electoral ladder you go, particularly in off-year elections, the lower the voter participation.
Hmm.
So, and then if you're talking about party primaries, you're talking about tiny numbers of people.
Hmm.
So, in say a historically Republican or red district, right, you can pick up a Republican primary seat for city council or state legislature with a few thousand votes.
Hmm.
Now, I recall being at a Christian Coalition conference where the political director was saying, "So, do you think we could find that number of people, in our churches?" You bet we can. So, systematically identifying and registering and training and turning out people into voters, to activists, to candidates, to legislators has been the strategy for several decades, and it's working. There's data from that just shows that white evangelicals, right, back, I forget what the number is, maybe in 1986, were constituted 26, 27% of the electorate, right?
Hmm.
And that number has continued, about the same level, say 26, 27, 28%, even as the percentage of white evangelicals in the general population has declined to 15. This speaks to the power and the sophistication of their political organizing, which is greater than any other sector of society. So,
Hmm.
why things are happening the way they are, it's for that reason, which gives us where the answer is. The rest of society is the majority, right? We may all religiously and politically disagree with one another about many things, but if we value constitutional democracy, we know what to do.
Yeah, it's all about that. You have to adopt the tactics that they used, and apply it across the board with a greater majority. And one of the things they did also is inform their people. And this is why we write pieces like we do. You see, I think we need to speak out and write and explain to people. Sometimes it's difficult and it's complicated, and you have to wrap your mind around groups and movements and names and whatever. But if you don't inform people, people don't know, and they just generally paintbrush, in general terms. It's not precise. They don't know what to target. They don't know what to look for. They're not sure on what to be alerted about. That's why we need to inform. This is why we have people like Fred that's been working on this for decades,
Hmm.
writing on this, and you, Stephen, and I'm trying to do my small share in my academic world. I think that's key. If you
Right.
have informed individuals, and when they're informed, they know what to do. it makes a big difference, I think.
Yeah, and I'll just add that cults have been hiring sociologists of religion to say brainwashing doesn't exist. They say they're happy, and who are we to say that any group is a destructive authoritarian cult? Because maybe Jesus had a cult, and so they just deliberately misinform and put out disinformation, and I'm wishing more Christian people would speak to the people in NAR, not attacking them, but really with love, with compassion, with respect. Ask questions that make them think and get back to the real values of love and humility and service, and not take over governments. And so that's a piece for me, aside from mobilizing all the former members of all types of cults who have left and are too ashamed or embarrassed to say, yeah, I was in Scientology, or I was in the Moonies, or I was in an MLM, or I was in a controlling relationship for 10 years, and I didn't see my family or friends. If everybody does their part also in identifying mind control really is real.
Mm. Because the thing is, if we wait for the prophetic standards to be applied, we might wait forever. You see, it might not
I'm
happen.
not waiting for the prophetic. I'm
No, no, no,
waiting
no,
for the
no, no. But
Constitution
that's
to
why
be
we
supported.
have
Right.
to engage. Because the thing is, it's been already a year now since the writing of the prophetic standards, and you see people like Stephen Strang involved left and right with all sorts of individuals, with the Reawaken tour, with all sorts of different rogue prophets, but he signed the prophetic standards. You
Hmm.
see, so you kind of wonder, what are you doing here? Is this just like a PR thing? Are you really looking for true solutions to this problem inside that specific movement? There probably are people in the NAR that are fed up with what's going on. But at
Mm.
the same time, there are people that are there that are playing both sides of the aisle. And we've seen that even in the 90s with the Kansas City prophet thing. At first, was very clear with people like Wimber. He took a stand. And then in 1994, there was the Toronto blessing. And he dissociated himself.
Hmm.
Like the church was in Toronto, a vineyard church. And
Mm.
because of the reports of all sorts of physical weird manifestations of animal noises and all sorts of stuff that were happening in Toronto, he eventually took a stand. But what is interesting to note with Wimber, despite the fact that he had the courage to actually take a stand and
Mm.
invite this church to dissociate itself from the vineyard, he did not he did not speak ill of the revival.
Mm.
There was something in him that kind of restrained him from speaking ill against it, because there's always, in the midst of these groups and these people, there's always a fear of, if they speak or start naming names. This is why you have no names, you
Mm.
see, in the prophetic standards. If you start naming names, if you start labeling stuff and saying stuff as they are, you might grieve the spirit.
You
You
may
might,
get sued.
yes, there's that. But amongst themselves, what's worse, in
Right.
spiritual terms, you
Mm.
might grieve the spirit. You
Mm.
might quench the Holy Spirit. So this is why there is hesitancy, I think, even after a year, where you have people still kind of, playing both sides. And I don't know, like we wrote, Fred and I, we're not sure if this is going to, in the end, really be enforced as they probably wanted it to be enforced from the beginning.
Right. I want to
Yeah, I
ask.
don't think it can be, and I think they have no intention
No.
of forcing it. I think they're hoping in appealing to their fellow, charismatics, that they can call them to, dare we say it, reason, right? Yeah, but I don't think that's going to happen. But here's the opportunity and the risk in what's going on right now. I mean, the risk is that we cheer for the people who seem reasonable, people who want to stand for prophetic standards. In fact, those are people with whom most of us disagree. They're theocratic activists. What theologies and activities they engage in are explicitly theocratic. And you don't have the time to go into all of that, but let me just say that one of the two co-authors or initiators of prophetic standards is this guy, Joseph Matera, right? He was one of the people who was on the original invitational committee to all evangelicals to come and meet with Donald Trump and see what he's really about. Matera helped to create Donald Trump, and now he's regretting the monster that he's created. But this is the opportunity, and that is for the rest of us to recognize this. There is a tremendous rift within the people who are the opponents of democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And Matera and Brown are among them. And all the people who are enabling this through action or inaction, as André says, are a part of the problem, right? We can identify that. It is so rare in public life that a formidable opponent, right, reveals its own most profound weakness. That's what the prophetic standards have done for us. And I think it's really important for people to look at it in that spirit, because an anti-democratic entity is in danger of collapse.
Yeah, absolutely. And Fred, I'm going to ask you, if you don't mind, you taught me about the existence of the Manhattan Declaration. And it just seems very important for the public to understand what's going on. Please.
Said before, there are many changes that have gone on in over the decades. People with certain religious and political visions come up with strategies, and they realize that no one can do it alone, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so they end up having to find, okay, how are we're going to have to agree on certain things and we don't want to compromise on our standards, but we have to figure out a way to work together to beat the people who are in favor of democratic societies and religious pluralism. So what happened was that conservative Catholic intellectuals and certain Christian right and evangelical leaders held a series of theological dialogues beginning in the mid-90s. And eventually they had a breakthrough. And this neoconservative Catholic professor, Robert P. George, said, Eureka, I've got it. And named three things on which he thought that the people he wanted to bring together could all agree. And these were, in his words, life, marriage, and religious liberty. And they did. And soon thereafter.
Well, life, I got to interrupt, forgive me. That's about taking away women's right to choose their own reproductive health care, correct?
That's what they mean by life.
Okay, just wanted to be clear. It's in the demise of Roe v. Wade.
It's opposition to marriage equality for LGBT people.
Right.
And religious freedom is a tortured understanding of the idea. But very soon thereafter, they got 500 people to sign on. And for me, the telling thing about why it's so important politically, but I would argue important in the history of Christianity, was it was the first time you had conservative evangelicals and Baptists and conservative Catholic bishops, agreeing to just about anything. These are people who were, to this day, don't agree on the legitimacy of each other's positions and religious offices. Ask Baptists whether they think that the Pope is a legitimate office. So, but politically they had to agree. So you have, for the first time, 150 sitting Catholic prelates signing on to a document with important evangelical leaders. This was unprecedented.
Yeah.
Knowledge, correct me if I'm wrong, André, but in American and global history.
In fact, I think that this declaration probably stemmed from a first attempt. I don't know if you were aware of this. Probably you were. There's a first attempt in 1994 with a document that was signed, and it was called "Evangelicals and Catholics Together." You had. Yeah,
There was a
that was
first of a series.
yeah,
That's what I'm referring
exactly.
to.
And you had Chuck Colson at the time. You had
Oh,
Richard
Chuck
New.
recruited Mike Pence into the family.
Yeah,
Had to
yeah. So
insert.
these people, and you had, for example, Richard Newhouse, and that was what Fred was saying with these specific points. That was a kind of a first foray in this possible coalition. It's interesting because at the time Timothy George was writing for the Christianity Today, and he actually labeled this effort as an ecumenism in the trenches. So just think about the mindset, what that speaks about. It speaks about war. It
Yeah,
speaks about cultural war.
hadn't thought about, but absolutely.
That's how
It's
he labeled that document.
but this
It's
was
So here, so with that in mind, here was the immediate upshot of
yeah.
the Manhattan Declaration. So those three ideas, life, marriage, and religious liberty, began to appear on the websites of all the politically active Christian right groups. It appeared on the website of the pro-life Secretariat of the Catholic Bishops, right? And most tellingly of all, uh, in Mitt Romney in his 2012 acceptance speech at the Republican National Convention for the Republican nomination, specifically named those three things. As a Mormon, he had a problem, but he wanted to signal that, hey, I'm one of you and you're with me. And that's how the moderate Republican candidate for president did it, right? That's how important the Manhattan Declaration was to everything from the center right to the far right in American politics.
Yeah, and I have to just go back to 1974 when I was recruited into the Moonies cult. And Moon said democracy was satanic and God wants a theocracy, and talked about infiltrating the government, and, talked about changing the Constitution to make it a capital offense if people offended quote, the Messiah, air quotes, around the Messiah. And I was told to fast for Richard Nixon during Watergate because God wanted Nixon to be president. And so for me, it's surreal in 2022 to see this, cancer that's metastasized so extremely. It's really shocking, but the cure starts, I think, with a correct diagnosis of what's going on. Who are the major players? Who are the bad actors who genuinely care about freedom and religious liberty and women's rights and gay rights and indigenous rights? And those who are authoritarians who want to keep doing fossil fuels and want to claim there's a hoax around climate change, and they were doing the same thing around the COVID pandemic.
And the people that follow them, that belong to apostolic centers or apostolic networks, they don't have any issues with this type of authoritarianism because they're already drilled
Right.
this way in apostolic centers and apostolic networks. You see, by this idea of apostolic governance, of accountability, there's some elements that's very, very close to the shepherding movement in the way things are administrated in these networks. So what they're experiencing at a micro level, a kind of internal dominion atmosphere, is now to be taken out of the centers and the networks into society. And the political or the marketing strategy to get there is, of course, the mountains. We know that
The seven mountains. Yeah, I have a list here, but you could probably do it by name.
Yeah.
But this is taking over Lance Wall now. Religion, family, education, government and law, media, news and commentary, arts and entertainment, and business and economics. And if they can control these 7 areas, then they can control everything.
Culture. Yeah.
Right. I also want to, for our listeners, I want to say I've done a ton of cases helping people get out of shepherding, discipling cults. And I just wanted to say that when I started my work, one of the big ones started here in Massachusetts. And basically, the leader said, I'm a prophet, and we're going to set up a pyramid structure with assigned disciplers who will be in the position of Jesus, who will look at your schedule for the day in 10-minute increments and make sure you're doing everything properly. And you have to confess to the discipler, even if they may be a newer member than you, or maybe they don't know the Bible half the way as good as you know it. But this authoritarianism that goes straight up, to the head. So this is old for me, but the last thing I want to say about it is I remember an old book that was used by leaders called the Master Plan of Evangelism, and I remember in the forward it said, the communists are brainwashing people for Satan. We need to brainwash people for Jesus. Huh? And of course, my argument with all Abrahamic faiths, cults of all Abrahamic faiths, is hey, however you want to understand the Garden of Eden story as a metaphor, whatever, God, Almighty God, didn't brainwash Adam and Eve to be obedient. So it must have been part of the plan to give choice and the ability to say, no, I'm not going to follow this, right? And then to follow in faith because it's your choice, not because you're being coerced.
The thing I want to say about the authoritarian aspect of all this, and that is you can't always see it.
Mm-hmm.
It's not evident. When you have hierarchical religious institutions, like say the Catholic Church, and you have no, like say Cardinal Dolan, right? And he's wearing certain robes and a certain garb, so you understand his standing, like in the military, forms and ranks and whatnot. With the apostles, you don't even see that. As André was saying earlier, they don't even necessarily use their title, right?
Mm-hmm.
Their standing in the spiritual movement.
Mm-hmm.
More likely to hear them to not even use a title at all. And
Right.
for me, one of the examples is Chuck Pierce, top apostles, right? And everybody in the movement knows he's the apostle. They read his books, they go to his things. I watched him in an event that took place earlier this year, and he's wearing a plaid work shirt and jeans. It's just Chuck, You would never identify him and say, "Oh, there goes a religious guy," right? Let alone a leader. Don't use the titles. They don't have the religious garb, and it doesn't look like a religious movement, let alone an authoritarian religious movement. And so you have to understand what they're up to in order to.
Right. Yeah, you have to look at the behaviors and assume that there's deception happening, whether it's outright lies or withholding vital information or distorting it to make it seem palatable. Like the Moonies would say, oh, we're pro-family, but they don't say, oh, we're the only true family and everyone else's parents are Satan.
There's a savviness to it, right? They know what's going to push people's buttons and cause a flash and a response that might overwhelm them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they react to
as much as they need to.
Yeah, and they react to labels and stuff like that. I remember I posted this recently on my feed about how in I think it was in 2007 or earlier, I can't remember, when the issue of dominionism came up.
Mm-hmm.
And they were all denying the fact that they were dominionists. No, we're not dominion. No, and it was a meeting between Os Hillman, Lance Wallnau, and Johnny Enlow, and everybody was like, we're walking on eggs, and Hillman was really embarrassed or kind of annoyed how people understood dominionism, and he wanted to really tone it down as much as possible. And Wallnau was saying, we need to be very careful because this is insider language. People in the media or people outside, you can't speak that way because they won't get what you're saying. Amongst ourselves, we understand ourselves. And Enloe was even at that point, at that time, Enloe was saying, no, we should maybe even not use dominion as a concept.
Right.
But
Yeah, I
but you
wrote in 1988 about insider doctrines and outsider
that's it. That's
doctrines,
it.
and you can
Exactly.
believe something inside, but don't tell anyone else.
And that's why it's important to read their stuff.
Yes.
You see, to familiarize yourself, watch their videos, even if you fall asleep sometimes. You have to look at the primary sources to know what they're talking about. You can't always rely on what someone else says about something. You have to know it for yourself. So
Yeah,
you need to
and
you need the inside baseball, like
but
you
I
No,
said.
no,
would
back
warn.
when controversy about dominionism first popped up and there was denialism going on, all you had to do was take out C. Peter Wagner's book, right? He's the founder of the Reformation with a great big title, Dominion.
Million.
And then his discussion in several parts of the book where he says, well, a lot of people said I shouldn't talk about dominionism and all this stuff, but I think we need to be right out there and say what we're talking about. And so he does. And then he even sources, his vision for dominionism based on the theocratic theologian R.J. Rushdoony, the seminal thinker of Christian Reconstructionism. It's in the book. He says, yeah, this, and this, and this. Here are my theological sources for this whole thing. But what is interesting, though, is that if you go looking for Rushdoony in the index, you won't find it. You have to read the book.
So interesting. But I want to warn our listeners. Andre and Fred are experts, and so they understand how to watch these videos and how to parse and how to be scholarly about it. And it's not for the faint of heart, because it's very droning at times and repetitive and toxic from my point of view. But I'm so grateful that there are people who are experts like yourselves who made the effort, who keep making the effort to understand it and then call out to the rest of the public, hello, this is what's happening. We need to pay attention to this. So I'm grateful for that, of course. I guess I want to come back to solutions. Any other solutions that you think of? I mean, I'm hoping people may want from other media will want to interview you both and do, bigger pieces to educate the public. But what other thoughts do you have about?
I think people should interview definitely Fred on this. His phone has.
Or
His
the
phone
two of you
hasn't been.
together, like I said. Hey,
That's
guys.
fine. That's fine. I'm all for that. But his phone is not ringing enough, and he's been working on this for decades, and people need to know about it. His pieces are regular on this stuff, and I think it's that. I think a big part of it is really we do the work. We try to translate this in manageable terms,
Yeah.
but people have to make the effort of reading. You see, our piece is a long piece. We have to admit we had to fight a bit with Evan on this, and go back and forth because it is a long piece.
Mm-hmm.
But it requires that. You can't know any of this. It's not like a fast food, solution.
Right.
You're going to learn about this in 5 minutes. It doesn't work that way.
Right.
So people have to invest.
We're going to do a
time.
blog with based on this, with
That's
all the
great.
links that you guys
Yeah.
want to put out
Oh,
to
I
the.
want to add to Andre because he's speaking to the hard part.
Yeah.
Right? They can slog through our article. It's not that long, but honestly, it's a matter of changing the solution we offered about doing democracy and all that good stuff. But if the task of democracy is to preserve and defend and advance it, again, we know there are historic adversaries and they're still around and they've changed forms. So it's the task of everybody to do some homework.
Right.
Sorry, you really do have to delve into some stuff. You got to read some books. You got to look at some videos, and hopefully you can find a wise teacher to guide you through it. But this is the thing. There are two main pieces to the task of this. One is people to have sufficient knowledge to even have a conversation, let alone concoct a strategy, right?
Right. Exactly.
You have to have some common vocabulary. Knowledge and vocabulary, meaning agreed upon terms.
Yes.
wants to come up with a bumper sticker. If we only call them this, then they'll be discredited and everybody will understand. Well, that's just baloney.
Right.
And that's me being very polite. So
So Fred, I want to name the article that I read and that prompted me to call you both and say, please, let's do an interview. It was in religiondispatches.org. It was August 9th that it was published, and it's by the two of you, Frederick Clarkson and André Gagné. New Apostolic Reformation faces profound rift due to Trump prophecies and, quote, spiritual manipulation of the prophetic gift, unquote. So check it out, and we will have a link to it. And please look at my past interview with Andre and several interviews with Frederick Clarkson and such. And as we wrap up in the next 5 minutes, are there any nonprofits, Fred or Andre, that you know of that are doing like real good work to counter this effort to subvert our democracy?
Fred, you know that
well, there are a lot of fine organizations that
yeah,
meet that criteria,
yeah.
Stephen. I have to say none of them. And so, to my friends and allies, take this video to heart. Nobody's talking about the New Apostolic Reformation, let alone the kind of rift and opportunity that we're talking about here. But people doing fine work about opposing Christian right and Christian nationalism include Christians Against Christian Nationalism, right?
Mm-hmm.
A wonderful joint effort of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, mainline denominational leaders, and even some Catholics and evangelicals. So that's something to look at. Americans United for Separation Church and State, the Interfaith Alliance. If you look at those three, that's a good start. There are more.
Great. I think it's so important that we not feel isolated and not feel helpless or hopeless, but to really think about what we can contribute, and not just money, but time and energy and effort to message people that we know. And we may know people in battleground states who are relatives or friends. And I've been encouraging people, if you've cut them off on social media or blocked them, time to say, I miss you, how are you? And if they're angry at you because you cursed them out, apologize and say, I'm so sorry, but you are important to me. And I really would like to understand what your thinking is at this moment. I really would like to step into your shoes and engage in a respectful dialogue where you're asking them questions that make them think and reality test.
Yeah, I would add to that there, in some cases, we may not have those kinds of rifts in our relationships. But remember, all these folks are in our own towns and our cities and our states. And the task is to figure out how are we all going to learn to live to one another, with one another in relative peace and harmony. So to understand that there are people who think like this and are starting to view you as demonic, right?
Mm.
Are you infested with demons in some way? We're only human beings who may differ on religion and politics.
Yeah.
We're only human beings. We're not supernatural beings,
Right.
out to create, be Satan's agents in the world, and with whom they're preparing to do physical battle. It's a matter. I think part of the task is related to what you're talking about, Stephen, and that's to de-demonize ourselves.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Figure out what our relationship can be and should be with people who may be headed in that direction.
Exactly. And I want to just say I was Jewish growing up, got into the Moonies, and I was shown the Exorcist movie, and Moon said God made this movie, and this was a prophecy of what would happen if we left the Unification Church. And I was afraid of my own thoughts after that. I was so obsessed with preventing evil spirits from invading me that I did the thought stopping, chanting and praying to get rid of the doubts.
Yeah.
So I was just reinforced in this indoctrination.
It's pretty exhausting living like that.
It is.
It's pretty exhausting. People that will have time to view the interview that I gave with Steven a few years back, where I talk about my own background. in
Mm,
there, where I used to be a pastor in a Pentecostal church. We adopted NAR practices. We did spiritual mapping, exorcisms, all of that. It is very, very, very tiresome to live
agreed.
that way. It drains you. You're constantly, trying to figure out how to be more pure, how to, you know, be less infested by evil thoughts, and also, so it's a hard life.
Yeah, and it's the
And
opposite of love.
yeah, yeah, exactly,
It's the
exactly.
opposite of peace.
Yeah, exactly.
It's
So
the
this is
opposite of
why,
humility
yeah,
too
yeah.
for the leaders
So
who
if you
are
can
like,
find something that could really reassure you,
mm,
and help you cope with these problems and answer some of your questions. I think people like you, Stephen, and Fred, and others do fantastic work for that.
thank you. So, Fred, what's the status on your new book project? Are you going forward, or
Oh yeah,
can you?
it's underway.
Great. So I'm looking forward to both of your books in English soon, guys. And I want to thank you for your intelligence, your insight, your stick to itness. That's not the right word, but you got the
We did it.
idea. Because we need to come together. This is a critical moment in human history, I feel. And we really need a supermajority in November, and then we can start writing laws to undo. And we haven't even talked about the Supreme Court and the Federalist Society and all of that. We'll do another one again on SCOTUS, guys. Thank you so much, and we'll talk again soon, I hope.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for your kind invitation.
Yeah, my
Yes,
pleasure.
thanks, Steve. Thank you for all your good work and keeping this going too.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks, guys.